Good morning, dear members of the Parliament, dear policymakers, dear Danish and French and European entrepreneurs, and dear guests. Welcome to the virtual roundtable on fostering entrepreneurship and innovation in AI in Europe. My name is Benedikt Blomeyer. I'm the head of EU policy at Allied for Startups. Normally, Peter Koffler from the Danish entrepreneurs would greet you, but unfortunately a medical situation makes it unable for him to join. So I'd like to start out by wishing him the very best and wishing him a speedy recovery as well. Let us take a look at the program for today. I think we can see it's about bringing folks from the entrepreneurial and ecosystem world to the table with policymakers. And if I can have the slide shared, that would be perfect. Thank you. We will start with a welcome address in a moment by Mr. Løkkegaard. We will then have a keynote address by Mr. Werner Steng from the European Commission. Mr. Løkkegaard is a member of the European Parliament. Just add that. Then there will be the first session with member of the European Parliament, Mr. Colarea, Julia Fenard from France Digital, and Renaud Vedel, who is the coordinator of the French AI unit. In the second session, we will actually listen to the practitioners. So we have Lars Maleux from Corti and Hugo Ruggieri from Doctrine speaking with us. And in the third session, we will also be joined by Mr. Dirk Staudenmayer from the European Commission with a look ahead at even more AI rules coming, and also Stephen Alstrup, who's in a dual capacity as an academic and a co-founder of a startup himself here today with us. I think we see it's an impressive lineup we have, and there's a lot of ground to cover. I will just start with a very little bit of housekeeping and setting the scene from our side. First, for those of you who might not have seen it, but this event is public. This event is being live streamed on YouTube. So you also have the opportunity to ask questions in the YouTube chat, and I will make sure to read to the speakers as best I can. So please make sure to ask questions. Use your opportunity to grill your MEPs and colleagues at the European Commission. We also have a hashtag Startups for AI, so please feel free to tweet away. I will just like to say a few words to set the scene. Obviously, we're all here because we see the exciting potential of artificial intelligence. I think we've all heard about the amazing potential and what can be done. But we've also come a long way since the bipolar discussions in Brussels a couple of years ago, where it was either killer robots or global panacea. So I think it's amazing today to hear from entrepreneurs who are actually working in the nitty-gritty and who are concretely doing something to improve people's lives. But the EU has asked a few years ago member states to make an AI plan, and now a few years later we have an AI Act on the table, which is all about on the one hand promoting innovation, but on the other hand also, of course, setting clear rules for AI to be developed in Europe. So it's very timely for us today to talk about this exciting topic. I'm joined with the Danish entrepreneurs and France Digital as co-organizers. We all thought it would be the perfect time to bring everyone together and have a discussion about where the train is going. For us, the AI Act will be a success if it leads to more entrepreneurs wanting to come to Europe to launch and scale up AI startups. We think that should be the litmus test of a successful AI Act. And we think this is better to be achieved or easier to be achieved if we are involving the AI entrepreneurs in the conversation. And that's, I think, the whole raison d'etre rationale for today's conversation. Now, in the current phase of the discussions, the AI Act is being worked on in the European Parliament in the committee phase now. There's a lot of discussions on what is low risk, what is high risk AI, so definitions, what should high-risk AI startups do? So what ex-ante compliance they should be facing, how sandboxes can be used to ensure a smooth path to compliance for highly innovative startups. I'm very happy that our first speaker is right in the middle of it, and maybe can tell us a bit about the nuts and bolts of the AI Act. Mr. Martin Løkkegaard, and I'm apologizing once in advance for mispronunciations because I'm not fluent in Danish, is leading here in the Internal Market Committee, which is central to the AI Act. And he will now give an opening address. Passing the floor to you.
Well, thank you, Benedict, and I hope that you can all hear me. And thank you to Danish entrepreneurs for having me. It's a great opportunity to speak about a very important issue indeed. First of all, artificial intelligence is not, as I see it, a threat to modern society. Let me be clear about that. It's an opportunity, and I think that your remarks also pointed to that fact. Not only for European businesses and startups, but also for European citizens and for future generations. With the help of AI, we will try to solve both global problems and everyday issues. That's the key of the legislation and our efforts. Artificial intelligence can be a tool as I see it, to find solutions to minimize our carbon footprint and ways of boosting biodiversity. It can improve diagnostics, but it can also help family filling the fridge with healthy food. And so it's all around us. The potential is enormous. For this reason, we need to strike the right balance in the future legislation. On the one hand, we need regulation. Let me be clear about that. That's the reason we are working with this, of course. On the other, be able to reach the full potential of AI, also for businesses and for the startups. Therefore, EU rules on AI may not stifle innovation in Europe. That's a key point. Unfortunately, there is a danger with the Commission's proposal, as I see it. One huge problem is the vague definitions concerning high-risk AI. The threat is that European businesses will drown in bureaucracy and everlasting approval processes. I think that's also learning from other parts of the digital legislation, which I have been involved with at least. The victim will especially be startups and smaller companies. So the Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, has indeed herself expressed concern that far too many startups has to leave the EU in order to scale up. And that, of course, is not the reason we're doing this, and we have to avoid that. If the EU wants to stop this trend, we need to act now, and we need to act properly. If the EU wants to compete with China and the US, and we do want that, we cannot scare business away with bureaucracy. That's a key point for us as liberals. If the EU wants to set the global standards for AI, and I think that's a good idea, we need legislation that works. So the key message from me today is we need legislation that works. That is the key. This is exactly why we need liberal solutions. Of course, I'm saying that as a liberal, and that's what I will fight for, and that we will fight for in the European Parliament. So I guess that will be my starting words. Thank you for your time. I need to get on a plane right now, so that's unfortunately I can't see you right now. I said follow this right now, but I will look forward to watching it on YouTube when I get a chance to do that. So thank you very much, and have a very good day.
And I will pass on a very big compliment for being a member of the European Parliament who is giving back 5 minutes. It's very much appreciated. I thank you very much for your opening words. I'm also, think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of, there are going to be some high-risk AI startups by the looks of it in presenting their business here in the call in a moment. And one of the things we're looking at closely is what ex-ante conformity assessment they will have to go through, and how we can make sure that there is no unnecessary or barrier, or the barrier is as small as possible for them, especially because startups are doing many things in new ways, and there's maybe not as an established process all the time for this. So, Mr. Løkkegaard, I will make sure to relay questions to you as well as they come through. But for now, I will make sure that you can catch your plane on time.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. And although Mr. Steng was scheduled next, he is also coming next. But I also want to, since he was the European Commission was referred to, give him a chance to use his opening remarks to also maybe give feedback to the thoughts and concerns that were raised by Mr. Løkkegaard. Mr. Steng is the cabinet member to Executive Vice President Margrethe Vestager, who's the Vice President of the European Commission, and of course digital files, as we all know, fall into her remit. So we have an expert from the top floor of the Berlaymont, basically, who can now tell us what the European Commission is planning here, where it sees the train heading, and everything else we need to know about this important file. The floor is yours. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and good morning, everybody. I don't think that in 10 minutes I can tell you everything you need to know. I would not know everything you need to know. I think I will also focus on, obviously, on the SME and startup dimension. You've all obviously seen and studied the AI Act in great detail, so there's no point in going through the motions and present it from A to Z. I found on your website, Startups for AI, the statement, you find the legislation complicated. Morten just said we need legislation that works, and of course I could not agree more. That's what we're all aiming to do, which is also why events like today's and your contributions are so immensely important. Don't forget, we're just talking about the Commission proposal at this stage in a very complicated field, the first legislation or proposal of its kind. So quite obviously there's still a lot of time ahead in getting it right. And you know, in terms of procedure, the Council has only started or done a first reading of the proposal last year. The Parliament has just now agreed who should be in charge at the first place. So there's a full year now coming up where both institutions are getting their act together, act in the truest sense of the word. And so any input that you can provide is still very much timely. Now, what does it mean getting legislation that works? I think we've been very clear throughout that we want both, and Morten referred to this as well. Of course, we want to maximize the opportunities from AI. We have not gone out to say that AI is evil and we need to regulate it to death. We said there's a huge potential in AI, and I don't have to give all the examples, they are well known. So we need to harvest them, we need to make them possible. Morten said he doesn't see threats, only opportunities. Well, he didn't quite say that. But I mean, we're also not seeing it as a threat, but there are risks, and there are real risks, and there's also perception sometimes of risks, and both are important if you want to develop technology, bring it onto the market, if people for good or bad reasons are afraid of technology. So we have this ecosystem of trust, the ecosystem of excellence, and you will have seen a lot of activity also in terms of promoting AI in Europe, of making Europe a global player in AI, of investing in AI. So there's a lot of talk about how to stimulate investment and innovation in AI. But for that, we also need a legal framework that brings the trust to the market. Of course, the starting point is values. And I think you also say this in your manifesto. You're saying AI is a tool to serve society. It must never compromise our values. This is exactly what we set out to do. What are the values? You know, it's fundamental rights, it's privacy, it's non-discrimination. It's of course also our health and safety that need to be assured. Now, if you get it right and develop a framework for trustworthy AI in Europe, that obviously that trust is the very engine for economic activity. I don't have to tell you, so that you can invest in that stuff because it will be accepted later on. We will provide, hopefully, and you made important suggestions there as well, legal certainty. And we have had so many, as you can imagine, so many conversations with business in the last 2 years since we launched the white paper. But they would all agree that legal certainty is crucial. If you don't know what you're allowed to do, what you're expected to do, and you invest, you develop, you do research, you try to bring things to the market, and then all of a sudden someone says, stop, that's not ethical, or stop, that's illegal, or whatever else. I mean, that's the worst thing that can happen to innovation. And then this legal certainty we need also in the single market. And if there's one thing that SMEs and startups would need to grow in Europe, and it's one set of rules for 450 million consumers. So trust, legal certainty, single market, in my mind, are really the biggest ingredients to an SME-friendly framework, if you want. That doesn't mean, of course, that the substance, the rules don't matter. Now, you already mentioned repeatedly risk-based, which was the first big decision taken, of course. And it was not supported by everybody in the public consultations, because we only high risk should be looked at. And others are saying, well, if fundamental rights are at stake, you don't have to distinguish between low and high risk. Fundamental rights are fundamental rights. But we said, no, we have to start somewhere. We focus on high risk. We have this wonderful pyramid, which sort of suggests that only on top of the pyramid are a few things that we don't want in Europe, a few things that at least where the risk should be mitigated. But for the rest of a pyramid, and that's usually the biggest part of a pyramid, we're saying, well, get on with it. There are laws and rules in place in Europe. It's not the Wild West. But for very critical use cases, we want clear mitigation measures to be taken. So it's also use cases. It's not the technology as such. It's the way in which it may be used to the detriment of societal interests. Now, we also tried to build on existing structures with long discussions about ex ante, ex post, conformity assessments or enforcement. And we said, well, for safety, it's a bit easier because where we have legislation in place where there's mandatory third-party conformity assessment already today, there are structures in place. Well, and if AI sort of falls into those categories, well, then we want this to be looked at the same time, not a separate mechanism. It's not that you take your product, go to conformity assessment in the traditional way, and then you knock on the door of another authority and say, well, could you please also have a look at the AI component? So we want this to be one process, duly integrated. When it comes to the fundamental rights part, there are no such structures in place. So even if we are concerned about potential risks for fundamental rights, we said, well, we're not going to ask for mandatory third-party conformity assessment, up front, because that would really stifle innovation. And on top of this, there are no structures in place, no capacity in place to actually do this, contrary to the product safety framework. So we said, well, it's mainly self-certification. You are developing or bringing to the market a high-risk application. Well, then you have to do the risk management that is necessary, identify the risk, take risk mitigation measures. Of course, they can also be checked ex post, but that's normal. But still, it is not that sort of before you can do anything, you have to ask for permission all the time. So that was the second main principle, I would argue. Then, very importantly, we did specifically look into SMEs as well and startups. And as you know, there's of course a specific article on this, but it's not the articles that will change the world, but their implementation. But we want, of course, to be sure that small business gets all the support, all the assistance they need. They should have easy access to information, channels to discuss with authorities, special support from innovation hubs and what have you. We introduced a sandboxing regime to which you also refer in your manifesto, which is very important, we think, that if you consider bringing something to the market, that you have a chance to discuss it, to test it, to get it validated by public authorities before you place it on the market. And here we're talking about priority access for SMEs quite naturally. We also know, of course, that we all need to learn. This is new, that stuff. Yeah? So we're also saying, well, all that experience that we are gaining in the rollout of this needs to be discussed, will be discussed at the AI board. There will be reporting to the board about good practices, lessons learned, recommendations. And I think especially the learnings from smaller companies will be super important here, and to see what further measures we could be implementing in order to make this happen. So what I'm saying is that what we have proposed was our best effort to square this circle. And believe me, it is very difficult to reconcile all these different objectives. We're obviously open to listen carefully, not only to stakeholders, but obviously to the co-legislators. I'm sure you will be having plenty of discussions in member states with parliamentarians. Make your voice heard. We are listening. And I'm most of all very glad that we have this debate in the first place. Well, that's probably the main achievement so far, that we have a public debate, and we've been having this for 2 years now, of the use of technologies, of the use of AI in our society. So let's make the best of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear Werner. First, very quick thought to the audience also. Mr. Steng was actually one talking about AI and going on AI panels before it was cool and before there was an AI Act. So you have a real expert in the room, and you've seen the dear entrepreneurs in the audience. That money do matter. They are read in the top floor of the Berlaymont as well. I have a quick follow-up question as well for Mr. Steng. If you could help us maybe to sort out or fit in a bit where in with past, current, and future legislative efforts. So the member states have, been asked to make their own AI strategy, but we also are aware that there's a civil liability aspects of AI file being worked on. So will this one be the one file to rule them all, and will there be more sectoral files coming forward? And how can we, where do you see kind of the simplicity also coming or being provided by the AI Act as an umbrella?
Probably two dimensions to your question. The first is Brussels versus member states. If there's a versus, it's with the member states. So as I already suggested, we have seen that individual member states have started in their AI strategies also to think about risks and how to address risks, not least through legislation. And that is the harmonizing effect, of course, that we want, if there are risks, and we think there are risks, then we want to develop one common set of rules so that a startup doesn't have to comply with different sets of rules when going from one member state to the other. The other way of working with member states, of course, and that you will find in the national strategies, is the pro-innovation side of things. That is also where we are working together with the member states. There's this coordinated action plan, as it is called, where together with the member states, we're discussing what we can jointly do to create a framework in Europe that is conducive to innovation and growth. Where can we link up the dots? Where can we improve research? Where can we invest? Probably also jointly, where one member state alone may not have the resources or the reach. So these are the member state related issues. The other is in terms of liability, that's more a sequencing act, if you want. And I think Dirk Staudenmayer will be there later with you. We separated the AI Act from the liability framework, if you want, because we said first we want to get the rules in order. So it's more the ex ante type of thing. So how can we avoid problems from emerging in the first place, damage from being done in the first place? This is what the AI Act is all about. Identify the risk, manage the risks, take risk mitigation measures. So obviously here the hope is that you will not have so many situations where actually liability really kicks in. But of course it's going to happen. But we said, let's do this in a second stage. This is why later this year, you will see what the Commission will be proposing in terms of liability. And there are two work strands being looked at. The one is the product liability directive, where it's about the manufacturer's liability and to what extent would that be affected if AI comes in. So a product is placed on the market, and through, I don't know, software updates and what have you, there may be some changes and risks after placing on the market. How does this affect the liability framework? And Dirk and his friends are examining other liability type of issues, but he is much more qualified than me to talk about this.
Thank you very much already. And I see we're running out of time. So I'm going to move on in just a moment. Before that, Mr. Steng, where would you love to see this file, or where would you love to see this 2 years from now?
Well, not only would I want to see this stuff adopted and agreed, but I would really want to see Europe as the place to be in terms of AI. So coming back to this regulation versus innovation, where I really question the versus in this context, that people say, well, Europe is the place to develop and use trustworthy AI. If we follow those rules, which are hopefully as simple as possible and can be complied with also by smaller business, well, then get on with it. 450 million people are here for a market to be served.
Mr. Steng is taking our pitch away from us, but no, this was a very good to hear, and it's, I think, good to understand that we are aligned. I think what the goals are concerned, I think the discussion is on how we get there best. And now I'd like to welcome the next speaker with his take on how we get a Europe that thrives in AI, but also has clear values on AI. From the European Parliament, as a member with the Green Group, Mr. Kolaya, the floor is yours for your opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to this event and organizing it, because that's really a very timely debate. We are now about to advance in our work on the file in the Parliament, so it's also really important to speak to the stakeholders and gather input. I work on the Commission's proposal in the Parliament in my role as an opinion rapporteur for the CULT committee. That's that's Committee for Culture and Education, and therefore I will use this also as an example in my opening remarks. But we need to keep in mind that other areas face similar challenges. I need to say that I was able to find quite some examples of applications of artificial intelligence and machine learning in the education sector. In culture, it is a bit more difficult. So I also want to use this as an opportunity. If you have any experience or ideas, the application of artificial intelligence and machine learning in the culture sector, I'm really happy to hear that, either directly here in the event, or feel free to send me an email. This topic is really close to my agenda because before I got elected a member of the European Parliament, I worked for almost 2 decades in the IT sector, and therefore I also worked on digital legislation over the course of the past 2.5 years, be it the regulation on removing terrorist content online, the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, and so on. For me, it is really key that we create a legislation that will foster the development and will enable the AI sector in Europe to grow, and at the same time will protect consumers, the users of the technologies, and the subject of application of artificial intelligence. And especially in a race with countries such as China, Europe really needs to create a standard for artificial intelligence based on the respect to privacy and fundamental rights, which then has a potential to become a world standard, something that we have seen with the GDPR, where the European legislation then became a de facto standard worldwide, or in several countries they are becoming inspired with the way how we approached this topic, and are on their way of drafting a similar legislation. Also, we need to keep in mind that we want to help European businesses to export and compete in this emerging and potentially really huge market. And since the regulation applies to the European market, European businesses will compete in the European market with technologies coming also from outside the European Union, and we need to make sure that in the European space, all of them compete on the same level. Which, I mean, that's maybe one of the biggest misunderstandings that I have met so far when it comes to the AI regulation, which is we are going to restrict European businesses. Well, that's not factually true. We are setting rules on the European market, and everybody selling and providing AI technologies on the European market will have to comply with these rules. Now, I mentioned my work on artificial intelligence in education, and I will give you this as an example. One of the core applications in this sector is so-called e-proctoring systems to monitor behavior of students during exams, to help detect cheating, and that is use which is increasing, especially during the pandemics, but probably there will be an evolution in this space also after the pandemics. And I had a really long talk with the main Czech agency organizing exams or admission exams for universities, CO.cz, and they in the end come to the conclusion that they would create their own e-proctoring system in collaboration with a Czech startup Born Digital after some negative experience with an e-proctoring company from Australia who had a different approach to protection of personal data and personal data of students. So, for example, they did not like that the practice was to provide footages of students to outsourced centers in India, where employees were about to check if the student was cheating or not. So you can imagine that tons of personal data of the students, including their room and everything that is recorded in that video. And so instead they created their own software with a team of professionals, and they are at the moment kind of worried about the legal aspects of their apps because, and I quote him, he said, "We are in a fog in this aspect." And this is not surprising given an example with other e-proctoring systems used in Europe. There was a system used in University of Amsterdam, University of Copenhagen, and University of Bocconi in Milano. And the usage of all were tested at courts and data protection authorities. And authorities in the Netherlands and in Denmark authorized the usage. But the data protection authority in Italy decided, due to the lack of compatibility with data protection provisions, the opposite direction. They did not approve. And that causes a problem for the universities, of course, who want to deploy these systems, but also for those who develop these systems because they don't know what the guidance for the usage of the system should be. So this legislation that we're speaking also has a huge potential in clarifying the legal aspects and bringing clarity and certainty for developers. I stop here, and I'm looking forward to the debate on this topic.
Thanks so much already. I will ask you a quick follow-up question, if you don't mind, because we will have speakers coming up who are sitting in Paris, and the French presidency has put forward an idea to define risk in the AI Act as risk to health, safety, and fundamental rights. Is this something you would generally agree with, or would you look to add other things, thinking from subliminal techniques? Or I know that your colleague for Rapporteur for Opinion, Susanna Solis, also wants to include in the definition of high risk any AI system that has an important negative impact on the environment. And if you are in favor of these, how do we maintain the legal clarity and simplicity that you were mentioning in your opening remarks?
Yeah, I expect a huge debate on in which category we put which software or which application. We have heard already from the speakers before that this, works as some kind of a pyramid, and the Commission, according to the impact assessment, they aim at roughly 15% of AI applications that would, fall into the category that is actually somewhat regulated. Now, my main a problem is not with the approach of the risk-based approach. My main problem is that I think that the low risk and high risk is, really pretty much black and white, while the space is not really black and white. And I think that there is a really broad use of artificial intelligence and machine learning there's a really broad spectrum of applications, and I think that we should think also about whether low risk and high risk categories are sufficient to this. At this moment, I think it's really premature to say which one should be where, but I think that it really needs to be on our minds that if we're deciding what exactly should be part of which category, that there is also clarity in deciding whether that type of application really has that impact or not. For that, I would agree, but I think that we are too early at this moment to discuss really what exactly should be in which category.
And 2 years from now, I'm guessing you also hope that the AI Act will be adopted and making more tech startups thrive.
That absolutely. I think on that, I hope all of us are on the same page.
Fantastic. Well, let me just very quickly add on that we also share the concern or are following closely that the distinction between low and high risk shouldn't lead to a huge legal chasm, especially if you think about entrepreneurs who are trying out new things all the time. There shouldn't be an artificial pull for them to stay away from what is high risk, because obviously there's innovative potential in both fields. And I think you're absolutely right to refer to and think about the incentives these definitions might set further down the line in ecosystems. And now I'd like to welcome the first representative of startup ecosystems. Julia Fenard is head of EU policy at France Digital. I think most member strong startup network in Europe, if I'm not mistaken. Now, you've heard policymakers, members of parliament, experts on the field speak now. How do your members see this file? And thanks also for joining as a co-host today.
Thank you so much, Benedict. So maybe just a quick few words on France Digital. You've already briefly described us, but we represent more than 1,800 startups and venture capitalists and VC investors. And of course, amongst our members, we have a lot of AI startups. We've recently produced a study which maps how many AI startups we have in France. And the good news is that we count more than 500 AI startups in France. And what we discovered is that they are actually young. 70% of them are less than 6 years old. They create a lot of jobs, more than 15,000 in France today, and they will recruit. They will create more jobs. And this year only, 2022, they will create more than 10,000 jobs. So of course, I think that the point today is that we're very sensitive to everything that can accelerate, hopefully accelerate their growth, or unfortunately impact their growth. So France Digital, our members, we welcome the ambition to promote European values through a more ethical AI system. But I think the point today is also to draw a little bit the regulators' attention on the risks posed to innovation in Europe. I think we all agree here today that the regulatory burden shouldn't discourage AI founders from choosing Europe, choosing France, Denmark, or Belgium to create their company, to create their startup. So at this point, sometimes the lack of clarity on the scope of the regulation, the difficulty of implementing certain obligations and their expected impact on startup, especially on those high-risk sectors such as education, law, or human resources startups, they worry a little bit the ecosystem. And the 3 points that really concern us are the following. First, on the high-risk AI system, sometimes we have the feeling that as the text currently stands, it is enough for a startup just to operate in a sector that is considered high risk, like the legal sector or the HR sector, to be considered high risk, even though their particular use case pose no risk to individuals. So we have plenty of examples in this regard. I will only mention one, is the startup doctrine, for example, from which you'll hear in a moment. So Hugo will tell you more about their case, but they have developed a search engine of legal decisions. So he will tell you a bit more on how this might or not be a high-risk AI system. A second point I would like to make is what we consider something that could be one of the major missed opportunity in the text, which are the regulatory sandboxes. It is probably the first time that sandboxes, which are so important to startups to develop their technologies, make it into EU legislation and regulation, and that's terrific news. That's really good. However, I think in the current form, we have little legal certainty for companies in the way the sandbox is drafted. For example, we don't know from which provisions of the regulation startup will get either a derogation or for how long, etc. So we would need to be a little bit more ambitious on the sandboxes so that it's actually used by startups and that we take all the benefits of this really good provision. And third, sometimes we worry also a bit on the consistency with the GDPR. I think that's something you've heard a lot, but our startups, it's for some of them that are super business oriented, if they had a quick look on the text, is the first thing they tell us. It's very hard for them to develop algorithms that avoid 100% discrimination, for example, on the basis of gender, disability, or ethnicity. These things are prohibited in GDPR. They can't collect that kind of data, and they can't treat these data. So sometimes they wonder and ask themselves how these two things would actually be consistent. To finish on a positive note, I would like to be positive also a little bit. The compromise text proposed earlier on this month goes in the right direction. The text proposed by the French presidency. The text is leaner, so some unnecessary provisions have been removed. Obligations are a bit more nuanced. For example, on the fact that training data sets should be free from errors only to the best possible extent. I think this little detail it just makes it more feasible and technically implementable. And the requirements for startup and SME are a little bit more flexible on everything that has to do with the technical documentation that the companies will have to produce. So some really good improvements. So we are optimistic on this text, and we hope they will be fit for startups and startup friendly.
Thanks so much, Julia, already. Maybe you can help me also preview our next speaker a bit by telling us about what the French startup ecosystem is hoping for on this file, and with the French presidency, since the real power brokers are sitting a few roads down from you right now. What is the kind of next case, and where would you like to see this file 1 or 2 years from now?
So actually, the French presidency and Renaud Vedel will be able to tell you a bit more about that. They have to take a neutral stance. So even as France Digital, we're not the best placed to advance the position of startups in this text, at least not alone. That's really my point. That's why, as a startup organization, during the French presidency, we have to join forces with the Danish entrepreneurs, with the German entrepreneurs, and to advocate for shared priorities as startup organizations and improve the AI Act altogether, because together we're strong. And we really look forward to collaborating with other startups and other ecosystems in Europe. So, for us, it shouldn't be a French presidency text, and it shouldn't be France Digital's fight only. I think the event today is really to show that startups communities are stronger together, and that we're advocating also for the same things.
Thanks so much. And I'm just reiterating also the shout out from Mr. Colaya earlier. All AI startups in cultural fields or AI pitches, please send them to marcel.colaya@European Parliament. I think it'll be very welcome. More examples are always good. Now I will pass the floor to Mr. Renaud Vedel. Julia, you already made an amazing preview. He's the coordinator of France's national AI strategy and also co-chair of the AI steering committee. Now we're very curious to hear how the file has been taken up by the French presidency and what the top priorities are and what you think is going to be happening here in this file in the next few months. The floor is yours.
Good morning, Benedict. Good morning, everybody. Well, I would say the first duty of an EU Council presidency is to be a loyal presidency, and France will respect the custom and ethics of it, which consists of the member state keeping its own conceptions in the background and listening to all the positions expressed by the member states, trying to determine an equilibrium barycenter, insisting on convergences, and working closely with the Commission and the members of the EU Parliament. As previous speakers have shown, the text is extremely dense and raises formidable technical and legal issues on many aspects of AI. We have seen this in the first reading in the Council under the Slovenian presidency, which took almost 6 months to read article by article. And now we have initial proposal for adjustments, but only on the first articles. And of course, we will hope to make progress on this point on other articles during the French presidency. Among those questions we can mention, well, firstly, the adjustments to the definition of AI systems to focus on what is really AI, what learns automatically, what adapts to situations. We are not regulating a philosophical horizon or a technology, but concrete AI systems with performative functions. And so we need to find a neutral definition that takes into account the very evolutionary nature of the technology. For example, 3 years ago, we were only talking about supervised learning, supervised deep learning, for instance, in the field of deep learning. And today, we feel the importance of taking into account transfer learning of large self-supervised multitask models. And we've seen that sometimes it can create challenges, and that was not necessarily at the first in the scope. Of course, clarification of the list of high-risk areas, especially those in Annex 3 that are not usually governed by sectoral regulations, will be very important, about insurance, about other sectors. We also need to avoid legislation that incorporates maybe conventional software that has existing for a long time and that does not pose any particular strong problem. There are also important questions, as Julia has mentioned, about the extent of the obligations on the data collection and maintenance cycle, and more generally the life cycle of systems, in particular with regard to the requirement for complete exhaustive data sets, which are not always realistic, as many of the consultative opinions have shown in the opening comments initiative. And above all, the most important point is undoubtedly the reconciliation and the conciliation between the obligations of the chain of production, distribution, and use of AI systems and the preservation of innovation, as has been mentioned earlier. We can see that we are dealing with very evolving and complex technologies, for which iterative development models, through trial and errors, through, I would say, dialogue with the market at the beginning of commercialization is important. We need a room of maneuver for adjustments, for addition of functionalities, and these are extremely important in the digital business. And we still don't have a perfect vision of how the business models of AI will be. And so for this, real operational sandboxes would be very useful, and also for some parts to the Commission, but on certain extent, and the states have to be cautious to how we will adopt this quickly and swiftly this text. Another decisive issue, I think, will be the question of the articulation with GDPR for the reuse of data that are useful for AI datasets, personal data. Of course, the objective of AI is by itself, by construction, to generalize. So AI aims at depersonalizing private data in training operations. We know there are risks of memorization by some systems. We know that there are risks of reverse engineering attacks in some cases. But overall, the risks related to training sets are very different from the risks, from the privacy risk of inference, and how we will be able to translate this appropriately into texts. Also, we have a very ambitious text proposal, which is the front runner in the global arena. So we will need to specify very cautiously the mechanism of evaluation, of notification, of control authorities, and also the timetable. AI, we all know statistical AI, autonomous AI requires a revision, a quite deep revision of traditional certification methods. Formal proof is not always possible, so we need to switch to confidence intervals, to redundancies, to human supervision, and it can vary a lot from sector to sector, from technology to technology, from use case to use case. So we'll need to respect what is at the core of the European legislation framework now, a room for certification, for standards, and probably on this matter also we will need to work at a global scale, so as to not put much more obligations on EU companies than outside companies. Because to take the example that the honorable member cited earlier, it will not be always easy to demonstrate that the system that has been conceived abroad, designed abroad, was developed using illegal or unethical data or methods. It will be difficult, quite challenging sometimes, to demonstrate it and to forbid it to get into the market. And finally, we will need to ensure that when the text enters into force, these mechanisms will be ready at work, and that they will work in a coordinated way by all authorities at the European level. So with this legislation, in a way that complements the whole package of text deployed by the Commission for the digital age, we are building stone by stone the whole edifice of regulation of the new industrial revolution that advanced digital and AI are building. We must do this while respecting EU values. We want technology to serve the citizens. And at the same time, we don't want to lose the technological race that is being launched. That requires us to excel in legislation framing and in institutional responsiveness. Thank you.
Very much for this passionate plea also. We have a few more minutes before we move to the next session, and I wanted to first of all use it to ask a follow-up question to Mr. Vedel. We've already heard from ecosystem representatives that having data sets free of errors, as you said yourself, is not possible, and that there's the proposal to reformulate and say that, to the best extent possible, data sets have to be clean. This is a very sensible to us and to the members we've spoken to so far. My question here would be, how confident are you this will fly in the Council? And secondly, we've also heard the proposal, as you mentioned, I think, for data minimization being brought in, which is a concept we know very well from GDPR, for full lifecycle of AI systems. Now, I mean, maybe you can also, for the entrepreneurs in the room, just explain why we are kind of going beyond or replicating parts of the GDPR here, why the kind of personal data, general data protection regulation is not enough in this way, and why it has to be, we have to touch on this again here. So maybe I would ask you to explain that a bit further for the members in the room as well. Thank you.
Well, you're right. Data minimization is the perfect example of how we had a principle that was used in the past for 40 years, or 20 or 30 years, and it is changing. We need to reinterpret it in the wake of new technologies. And for instance, if you want to have unbiased AI, unbiased means as efficient for small groups as for the global population, then you need as much as training data for this small group as necessary to achieve a performance target. And then you have a trade-offs with AI. Like often in principles are not like a checklist. Then you check every principles in every legislative framework. It's like in the constitution. They are contradictory. You have to make balances, trade-offs, and probably we see that in the AI proposal by the Commission. We see some tension between on the minimization principle, for instance. If you want to retain for the whole life cycle enough to prove, to guarantee security, then you have to get more data. But again, it could be sensed as a bit dangerous by some. But if you distinguish the training phase and the inference phase, then you can be as strict as earlier on the inference phase. And then if you have a third party, I would say a trustworthy party, or a tiers de confiance, a third as we say in French, then it can monitor the data, curate them, and make sure that these data do not go wild in the open. That's the kind of trade-off we will need to make.
And I know we'll now hear from some of the startups who are maybe going to say that they are not always able to maybe separate the kind of development and the rollout and production as cleanly. Many startups we speak to are constantly trying out new things, especially in AI, and end up maybe building an AI software which is doing something completely different than they might have initially hoped for. And I will pass the floor over in one moment, but I've asked everyone where their hope is 2 years from now. Now, the French presidency is, of course, also doing the French elections, and in a few months already, it's going to be kind of a bit more tricky to make progress on the file, as you know. So maybe my question is, what do you think will be done in the next 2 to 3 months on the file? What's kind of the best case scenario you are gunning for?
Well, our aim is to progress as much as possible. So we have a very huge agenda, lots of meetings in Brussels, lots of explanations, and well, I say, I don't know. Let's try to at least progress on half or 2/3 of the text, but as much as we can do, with good faith.
Thank you very much for providing us this overview from Paris. Also, just reminding the audience members who might have joined a bit later that you can always use the chat function to ask questions, and I will relay them here. Let me thank already the honorable speakers who've joined, and now I will pass the floor over to someone who's on the ground, a practitioner, Lars Malø, who's the, I think, co-founder and CTO of Corti. What is Corti all about, and how are you using AI to help in Europe?
Thank you so much, Benedict, and thank you so much for the very interesting talk so far. Interesting to hear more about what is happening on the legislation side of things and so forth, and the political side as well. So, Benedict, you mentioned it. My name is Lars Malø. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Corti. We are a startup started back in 2016. We are right now 100 employees in the company. Expanding increasingly in the US as we speak. I also hold an associate professorship in machine learning at the Technical University of Denmark. I've done a lot of research in unsupervised and semi-supervised deep learning, especially Bayesian deep learning. So I am first to talk a little bit about our case. And then I'll add some comments to the topic of the day here, and hopefully I'm so successful that my message is clear enough for you to ask some questions afterwards. So we should have some slides up on the screen. I don't know if they're there. I don't see them, at least. Okay, sounds good. Sounds good. So basically, as far as we see. One thing, we talk about AI a lot, Me as a practitioner and also a researcher within AI, I have no definition of AI whatsoever. I can give you a gist, and I'm sure that if we ask around the room right now, that I could hear a lot of different interpretations of what is AI. So I would love to not see it as a self-contained intelligence, which I think that is within the terminology of AI here, but rather a way of helping in making the right decisions. And it's just another help, similar to algorithms that we've seen so far in computer science that are helping us in making decision making, all the way from if-else statements until these machine learning models that can work on more complex data, and thereby helping on us making more complex decisions, such as autonomous vehicles, such as image segmentation for tumor scans, helping the doctors on finding out whether a tumor has cancer in it, and so forth. And that leads me to our case. We have built a startup that is using machine learning in order to understand what is going on inside consultations. And consultations are basically normally dialogues between two human beings, a medical doctor and a patient. And there are, according to McKinsey, 86 billion consultations worldwide a year, at least of them recorded in the medical sector. And a lot of the cases here are cases where the patient is trying to tell the doctor as evident as possible about their medical situation, and having the doctor trying to help them on their assessment and also a treatment plan. So we have built an AI that is helping every medical decision maker in getting superhuman capabilities through the power of AI. And what we're basically doing is that we're looking into the conversation between a patient and a medical professional. We're collecting a lot of signals through that conversation, semantic signals such as questions and answers to those signals, all the way to giving them a recommendation on where to look, what to ask for, etc. inside that consultation, such that they can hopefully have a higher accuracy when they give feedback to the patient, and also do that faster. In terms of speed, we started our company within emergency medical services. So when someone is calling to a 112 line or 911 line in the US, then we basically listen in on that emergency call and helps the medical professional that is answering the phone call on finding out what's wrong with the patient and what ambulance to send, and how to instruct on pre-arrival instructions. We started out with driving evidence, basically for our own for our own sake here, and finding out how good are we actually, and how good is our technology. And there we banded together with clinical researchers from our customers that were working on validating our AI, and they were validating first of all the AI in terms of cardiac arrest detection. Cardiac arrest detection is one of the most severe incidents that can happen to a 112 line, hence one of the most, if not the most severe incident that can happen to a patient when calling into the medical system. Here we found that the AI was actually able to detect a lot more of these cardiac arrest cases than the human being on their own, and it could also detect it faster. So a lot of the media attention can quickly become this AI is magical. It can listen to something that the human cannot listen to. Me as a researcher, I know that it's not magical. It's looking and listening to the same audio as the human being, but it's basically able to crunch more data and have more recollection of history, and also listen for some cues where the human being might not have the stamina or the energy or the so on for that given case. Think about in some places, especially in the US, they're sitting on 24-hour shifts answering these phone calls. So if you sit on your 23rd hour, you start thinking about when you get home to your family, what to cook for in the middle of the night, and then suddenly you get a cardiac arrest call that is 0.7% of the prevalence of the normal calls that you get. So it's not very normal to get a call like that. It's really easy to miss a cue. Hence, the AI can help you not miss that cue. We are currently, as a company, covering plus 25 million patients, and we are doing that with systems on data analysis, on this decision making or assistance here throughout the phone calls. And what we're currently looking into, and we have onboarded our first customers, is within primary care. So everything from nurse triaging lines to insurance company calls to the primary care clinical practice, where our AI is listening in on that consultation, and again, same use case, helping the doctor, nurse, whatnot, on making the right decision as quickly as possible for the patient to be in good health. Our technology spans over any healthcare system. It's basically an AI engine that's in behind the scene here. So you can use that in video conferencing. You can use that in phone calls. You can use it also in the live physical conversation. So I hear a lot of talk about ethics within AI, and I think it's always interesting to hear what people has to say about it, ethics. And my simple natural sciences mind always have a difficulty when we talk about. Hence my first comment, when we talk about a term where we can have a long discussion on what that term actually means. Not that we shouldn't use the term, but we should at least be aware that we can all have a long discussion on what the term means. So when I ask the right people what ethics mean, and that's, for instance, the anthropologists, they will have a long discussion, and they will have an eager discussion amongst them in terms of what is ethics. So think about that for a moment here. Now we talk about legislation and regulation, and we're talking about ethics, where the specialist can have a long discussion on what that is. We're talking about AI, where the specialist can have a long discussion on what that actually means. So it's two difficult terms here that we're bringing into the same context. Then we're bringing new words in, such as trustworthy. We're bringing new words in, such as fairness. Again, words that are really difficult to actually find a meaning to. I'm just stating the obvious here. And then I also hear some inherited terms, such as we need to ensure that the AI should be unbiased. It's an interesting statement, right? Nothing is unbiased. So let's be clear about that. I also understand the intention of saying that we should get the system as being as unbiased as possible. But it's important to mention that we cannot ever have a totally unbiased system. But what is interesting for a use case like ours is that we would love to have it less biased than the human being, and as soon as it's less biased than the human being, it has a place on Earth, and it has a place on Earth in the production here. So, and then finally, I brought in this picture. I don't know if you know about this picture with the policeman that is stopping one of the autonomous vehicles from Google because it's simply driving too slow. I think it's a good case to bring in here, because I think that when we talk about these AI systems, if we ensure that they're actually documented, and if we ensure that they have gone through the scrutiny of research and validation and so forth, we should not be concerned about bringing them into production. Since if that scrutiny has happened, it's nothing more than setting a normal algorithm that we have known for many years into production. That brings me to my last comment here. We've been a part of the regulation talks we've been a part of that for a long period here in terms of the European Union, and I think that one of the things that we see as a startup, being in the healthcare sector, being in the sensitive data field, and being in the AI field, it's difficult to find out what we're regulating here. I see that a lot of people are using the term ex ante. That's a wonderful term to use. I respect that, but bear in mind that it's also a dangerous term to use here, right? Because we can also stifle innovation. I'm just going to bring some points into this setting. That GDPR is a wonderful regulation to a certain extent. There are definitely some things to work on, but it's something that we understand as a company here, and it makes sense to the data. Now we have the data handled. Then we have the MDR, the medical device regulations, right? That is also somewhat understandable. I think that it could have a new revision also based on the new software systems. I think that we can also all agree upon that. But then we have the AI regulations, and we see a lot of overlapping things when we look at the MDR and the AI regulations. And it's really difficult for us as a company here to actually know what to be regulated by, and we should probably be regulated by both, but we also need to comply to the same things in both. as far as we see at the moment. And that, in my opinion, I'm not saying that anything is wrong with the regulations, but we should be aware that can create noise in terms of innovation and stifle the how fast we can go to market. We, as a company, are right now betting the most on the US market because it's more conform and it's faster to go to market, and that's at least something to take into account when we talk about regulations inside the European Union. I'm just being cruel to the Danish government here by bringing one of their sentences into one of their AI strategy brief. And they mentioned in that strategy brief that artificial intelligence shall assist us with analysis, understand, and make better decisions, but the technology cannot and will not replace human decisions. I think that's interesting. That makes it very difficult for an autonomous vehicle to ever get into the European Union. It's an example of how quickly we can actually make a mistake when we're talking ex ante here, and we don't have the right use cases in mind when we talk about regulations. Thank you.
Klaas, this is already super helpful. And I recall when you visited the European Parliament, this was before Corona, 3 years ago, and Corti was, a lot smaller and very focused on especially the EMS part of your portfolio. It's amazing to see how far the company has come and how successful it is, but also that you're looking at different fields where your innovation can potentially benefit patients. My follow-up question to you is, seeing that you are trying out things and listening, trying to understand what patients need, and seeing where technology can be helpful, as you said, and the previous speakers called for also data minimization. How do you see this this tension working out for you? And every time when you will have a new product service, having, as you said already, a few legislative files you have to be compliant with. How can this be done in a way where it's as easy and convenient for a startup, which is literally saving lives, as yours?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a really difficult question to answer, right? That's also why I have my occupation and other people have their occupations here. But one thing at least that I would love to, and I think that message should be clear from also the presentation, is that if we can just make sure that when we have something that we talk about, a definition, AI, ethics, trustworthiness, fairness, and so forth, we have a very clear definition of that. If we don't have a very clear definition of that, then we have a problem. So, and I can give you an example of what that then results in here, because it results in us building AI systems on the safe side of regulation here, right? So then we would much rather do post-analysis analytics of data, such that we don't have the live augmentation, even though that system can probably help even more, right? So I think that where we get really stifled is when the text that we read in terms of what we should obey to, and it's not clear at the moment.
Thanks also for being super concise. Your plan in terms of scaling across the European Union 1 to 2 years from now with the AI Act, maybe in a nutshell, what's it looking like?
So it's right now we are deployed across Scandinavia, which is our home turf here, and then we're deploying across the US for the next period here. Probably France is going to be the next country to really deploy into for several reasons, and this is for the reason that a lot of innovation is happening inside the public sector in France at the moment as we speak, and the data regulations are to a certain extent clearer in terms of what is allowed and what is not allowed and so forth. And it's just it's a strong and also and a lot of the healthcare services are distributed nicely, so it's easy to attach our system into a distributed healthcare system. So, so when you ask me in 1 to 3 years, we will have our systems running at least in France, hopefully other European countries, and we will get closer and closer to live augmentation and also automation, where there's no human to tend to the patient.
Thanks for helping me with the perfect segue, because we now move to France, and I'm super happy to present Hugo Ruggieri, who is the legal director and DPO at Doctrine. I'll let you explain yourself what Doctrine does, probably far better than I am to do it. I'm probably right in saying that it's already a scale-up now. And please tell us what is Doctrine all about, and we're looking forward to hearing your opening remarks, Hugo.
Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for the invitation. I sure hope that Corti will come to France soon, because the product seems amazing. And so France is an area for startups, and especially AI startups, to grow their products, as I hope Doctrine will be able to show. So our sector is the legal sector, and our aim is to try to foster access to justice using AI. The problem we are aiming to solve is quite simple. I have some data to show you. Basically, when law professionals attempt to make a decision to help their clients or help their in-house clients, so lawyers with their defendants, and in-house counsels for their companies, well, I need to take into account the regulations and case law that apply to their current problem. The situation is currently in France, since 2017, 318 new laws have been adopted. And so these laws can either create new regulations and new obligations to abide by, or actually change past obligations and past laws. In the same time, 3.3 million court decisions were rendered by all of the French judicial system. And this, so this is in 2020. It's actually a very tiny number compared to usual numbers due to COVID. Normally, French courts render approximately 4.2 million decisions per year. In the same way, there are more and more legal information websites that try to make sense of all of this data and try to give law professionals the keys to understand all of these new rules and all of this new jurisprudence. So Doctrine currently indexes more than 4,000 of such websites. And all of these new rules, all of these new laws, all of these new obligations are set on parliamentary works. So just as right now the European Parliament is working to produce lots of legal documents that explain the intention of the legislator with this new act. Well, the French Parliament functions in the same way, and more than 250,000 such documents were produced since 2017 to explain the 380 laws. So I think you get the gist of it. Being a law professional today in France, but I think the situation is quite the same everywhere in Europe, is hard, because you not only is your topics very, very specific and very, very detailed, but also your legal environment is ever changing. So this leads to something very unfortunate for law professionals: doubt. As a law professional, you never want to doubt the solution you chose to follow, because it leads to legal uncertainty, and so to bad choices. I think a good metaphor is driving on a road where new forks are built every day, and so your map can never be up to date. And so our aim is to use AI to bring certainty, to offer certainty back to our to law professionals. The way we do it is via AI, because all of this legal information can be considered as data, and AI is great at handling lots of data, as just explained. So the way we use AI is we try to we try to make sense of all of the information that is present in the legal text. We do so with what are called natural language processing algorithms. And so at Doctrine, we use both manual rules to identify certain criteria and certain information where manual rules are actually enough to work out. But most of the times we rely on machine learning to try and process as much data as we can and refine our algorithms in a better way. The core of our product is actually named entity recognition, which means being able to identify certain categories of texts and certain categories of information inside the legal document, but also the context in which these information appear, in order afterwards to build a mesh of legal information and provide more sense, as I will try to explain a little further on. I think a little detail maybe on how the product works. I showed you an extract of a court decision, a fictional one. So named entity recognition, the basis, as you can see, is really to try and identify certain words, certain keywords, certain expressions, but also, as I mentioned, the context. If we can take the example of the city of Paris in this little text, we can see that Paris is both the city of the jurisdiction that is rendering the decision, Paris Court of Appeals, the city of the jurisdiction which rendered the past decision, which is currently attacked, the Tribunal de Grande Instance of Paris, but also the bar in which the two lawyers that are defending the parties are working in. So identifying the term Paris is great, but we also need to identify the context in which this word appears. Otherwise, we are not producing any intelligence for our clients. And so this is why machine learning is actually great, to be able to build a whole context around all the words that we identify, and thus allowing us to build our products. Our vision is what we call the legal graph. Just as, for example, internet and the web functions as a mesh of web pages, all linking one to another, our vision is that law and the judicial system as a whole is also a mesh of legal information, linking one to another and pointing one to another all the time. A court decision will come there is never alone. There's always an affair. So maybe a court of appeals decisions will come after a first instance decision. It will also point to other case law that is relevant. It will point to other laws, the laws that the court decision is actually applying. And so you have a mesh like this of court decisions, of legal information, of laws and regulations that are being applied. And legal commentators also use other court decisions and other laws to explain what just happened. And we therefore can build a real web of legal information. And so this is really the vision behind Doctrine, using machine learning and named entity recognition algorithms to try and rebuild this legal graph and bring sense to our clients. The aim is therefore to try and centralize as much legal information as we can. Where before Doctrine, the vision of the French legal information market was to try and have law professors select certain kind of information and write about them and give away their vision of how the legal system works. Our vision is to try and give all law professionals the tools to be able to make their own mind on what is the current situation of the legal information and what is the French law currently working and how it's working on a specific case. So we try to centralize as much information as we can and then use our search engine, but also our notification system to bring the relevant information to the legal professional, to the law professional at the right moment. So we are able not only to make sense in the huge data set, we have more than 10 million court decisions, hundreds of thousands of regulations and parliamentary works, links to thousands of websites on the internet. And so we are able to make sense of all of this information when a law professional is actually using our product to search a specific question and get the correct answer, but also to try and notify the law professional that something has changed, and so that a new information has come that might change the way he or she sees the problem, and so try and, like this, be proactive instead of only reactive, which once again offers lots of certainty to law professionals. And the last point where we are quite proud of our product is that we are also able to automate certain actions. Name entity recognition, for example, is something that law professionals actually do during their work when they receive a new document, for example, a new summons against one of their clients. They need to analyze all of the summons and identify which texts the opposite party is relying on, which case law the opposite party is relying on. And so we are able to automate all of this process and make the job of a law professional not easier, but centered on where humans have more value, and allow law professionals to actually bring their own added value, strategy, reasoning, instead of spending time searching and analyzing law documents, legal documents. So this is actually a success right now. We have more than 8,000 law professionals that are paying for our product. We provide it for free to all French judges, and so we also have thousands of French judges using our product, and so tens of thousands of law professionals are using Doctrine every day. We employ 85 people, and we hope to continue growing. Hopefully around Europe soon. Maybe we can change countries with the Corti. And so we are really hopeful that the AI Act will help us in this way, as I will go on in a few seconds. I just wanted also to highlight that not only is AI helping us help law professionals do their job better, and so make the whole judicial system function better as a whole, since when law professionals are happy, obviously their clients are happy, and so everyone is happy. But we also use AI to provide to strengthen the protection of privacy for natural persons. And I think that's also a very important point in what I will try to delve on just in a few seconds on how the AI Act should work, in our opinion, is that we use AI not only to publish a product, but also to protect people. What I mean by that is that when we publish millions of court decisions online, we are actually posing a risk for the privacy of these persons. You don't want a court decision mentioning personal facts to be accessed by everyone easily. And this is actually a huge challenge, since we publish as I mentioned, 10 million court decisions currently. No more lights. And so the way we are able to make a balance between the privacy of natural persons mentioned in court decisions and our job is actually using AI to anonymize, if I want to be a good lawyer and respect GDPR, pseudonymize the court decisions by replacing the names of the parties by random letters. And this is done with AI, with a deep learning algorithm that actually achieves extremely high rate of success. Currently, our algorithm is reaching 98.5% of success on this job, which is the highest level of the state-of-the-art currently in France, even higher than other competitors or the French high courts. And this allows us to publish these court decisions online with the certainty that we are doing our best to find a balance between providing more legal information online and at the same time doing so with respect to people's privacy. And so here AI is actually essential to our job, because we couldn't be able to do so without this deep learning algorithm that achieves such high rates and is continuously learning for the anonymization of court decisions. Now, maybe closing remarks on our approach to AI regulation. As I mentioned, the AI is really the core of our product, and we wouldn't be able to do our job without it. And therefore, we are, of course, very aware of what is happening right now and follow it very closely. Our opinion is that the AI Act should be sectorial, risk-based, bring back the notion of accountability and pro-innovation. 2 words on each notion. Sectorial first, because I really believe that the challenges of the autonomous vehicle, of facial recognition for surveillance, for example, have nothing in common with the anonymization of court decision or the identification of legal information in a legal document. And so I really think that the specific challenges faced by certain users of AI should have their standalone regulation and should be taken into account in their own way. I am doubtful that we can have one regulation that handles all situations, and so I really think that we should try and find something more specific and something more detailed, because the challenges really aren't the same. Risk-based is already the vision of the AI Act, but I do regret some points that were mentioned in the AI white paper, which seems to be already ages ago. Because today the risk-based approach is, I think, too large. As Julia mentioned, my vision of how the risk-based approach works right now in the AI Act is only sectorial. And so being in the legal sector de facto makes us a high-risk AI. I regret, I went back to look for it, and so I can quote a sentence of the AI white paper, which used to also incorporate a notion of risk and that the use of the AI actually poses inside the sector. There was this sentence, and so I quote, "The assessment of the level of risk of a given use could be based on the impact on the affected parties. For instance, uses of AI applications that produce legal or similarly significant effects for the rights of an individual or a company, that pose risk of injury, death, or significant material or immaterial damage, that produce effects that cannot reasonably be avoided by individuals or legal entities." I think this vision is actually what should be regulated, and that not only should we regulate certain sectors, but most importantly, high-risk users inside these sectors, and so necessarily have a vision of what a high risk is, and have an assessment case per case. Accountability, I think this, I can go quite fast because it's a notion that we are starting to know quite well thanks to GDPR. I think GDPR has shown that the principle has limits, but it serves as a good bottom line of compliance that pushes everyone to be better. And so I really think that the AI Act should incorporate this principle once again. And finally, pro-innovation. There is this quote that is attributed to Uncle Ben, Spider-Man's Uncle Ben, but also to Voltaire. And so I will try and push for the Voltaire interpretation. With great power comes great responsibility, and I completely agree with this quote. But I think a corollary is that with little power comes a smaller responsibility. The size and maturity of the company should be taken into account. Mechanisms should be put in place to foster innovation and to help small companies achieve compliance. And I just wanted to illustrate my point on risk-based and the sectors with an actual quote from the AI Act itself. My vision is that currently the definition of the AI users inside the legal sector actually encompass all kinds of legal search engines, despite these legal search engines, like even the search engine on the ECJ's website, not posing any threat to persons. And so I think we should really rethink the way we define the high-risk users inside each sector to be very specific and actually encompass only the users that pose a high risk. Thanks a lot. I hope I wasn't too long.
Thanks a lot, Hugo. Very, very informative, also for those folks like myself who are learning about AI a lot. And it's not just encouraging to hear that the amount of folks suing each other has not gone up during COVID. I would have thought it's the opposite, kind of living with your neighbors in confined spaces all the time. But it's also really interesting to hear about your story. And I do have questions, but I notice we are just running a bit behind. So what I would do is see, Hugo, if you can maybe stay and join the ensuing panel as well. Not just because of your AI expertise, but also because of your legal expertise. Since that is, I think, what will also be needed when we look at civil liability aspects of AI in a few minutes. Wow, everyone, there's been a lot to go through already. I would try to take a breather, but we are keeping our foot on the gas pedal just a bit more. I will now pass the floor to Stephen Alstrup, who has two hats on, as I said, who is on the one hand there as a professor, and on the other hand is the co-founder of a startup himself, of Subwiz. Stephen, why don't you kick off our third and last session and share your thoughts on today's topic?
Thanks a lot. Could I first ask a question? How many participants do we have right now here? Can we see the number? How many people is out there? It's just nice to know.
That's a good question. I'm not sure because I'm trying to check simultaneously online. But I know we've had, because we also have some re-streamers who share it with their networks. So I'll try to get back to you.
That's
okay?
That's complicated. Thanks a lot. So I'm an algorithm professor, but I'm also been making startups successfully and been selling them. And I also have a startup right now, which maybe is a scale up. We are 35 people doing customer service and support. I'm actually also have a master's degree in philosophy, so I can talk about ethics if that is interesting. And yeah, I've been also been working for a long time for the shifting Danish governments and helping with all kind of stuff, both the new digitalization strategy in Denmark, but also being hands-on with the practical problem to implement AI to support where needed here. So that's a lot of different things I've been doing. So from my point of view, I can best explain my point of view with AI talking about cookies. I'm sorry for that. It's so when you update the cookie law or have to do something with the cookie law here, then you have all companies have to read the new law and have to update the homepage and etc. here. That's the same burden for all companies, but it's a really small burden for Facebook or whatnot here. Big companies, it's one guy doing some small job. Maybe it's one full-time employee sitting looking at the new laws and updating and so on. But taking one full-time employee out from a small company, that is really hard. So all these regulations, as I see it, have a twist where it hit the small companies much harder than the big companies. Yeah. And the funny part, and maybe not the funny part, I don't know, but when I hear about the bad stories here, it's like, especially with the social media, I totally agree. Totally agree. Let's do something with the social media. It's a big problem. I really hate what I'm seeing here. But it hasn't changed. It's still the same. It's the same here. And what's also the same is that it is US here, which have all the biggest IT companies, and Europe have only small companies here. And this kind of what we're doing with more regulation is that we just make it even more harder for the small companies in Europe to get bigger here. So it kind of just, what we're doing here with all this regulation here, it hasn't changed anything so far for the big companies. But the only thing is changing for the big companies is that they have to buy up fewer companies from Europe here because we have regulation killing them. That's what I'm saying. If you talk about AI specifically, if you read the definition of the AI, then it's like everything is AI. Your elevator is AI. Yeah, I think even your book is an AI. Everything is AI. So we're talking about regulation of everything. everything having anything with IT here. And also, it try really to be technical, insightful, the new regulation I'm looking into here. But it's not. I mean, it really don't understand AI here. And this is like, you know, I mean, I can understand this, that you have the need to say, if you're driving a car, you should stop when there's a red signal. But trying to be technical, explaining how to stop, I don't get that part. I mean, and I don't see the competence in putting that into a law. And that is what I'm seeing going on right now. This is what should go on here. And I'm really afraid for this part too. If you look at the GDPR, that was kind of not talking at all about what kind of technology are you using, only talking about how should you protect privacy here. But in the AI here, first of all, it's a definition covering everything. Secondly, you try to explain what is the technology. I mean, this is bad too. Then we know for GDPR that it's something which are making a totally freeze of everything going on. In Denmark, we are really, I mean, every law we have to 100% fulfill it. That's just how we are. So in Denmark, we didn't do any IT for a whole year. That's when the new GDPR coming out here. Now we're just starting doing a little bit here, but you should take the whole economy here and then just say freeze for 1 year. And then you should ask yourself, what is the benefit we're getting out of it here? And if we look into the historic perspective here, then what we were trying to say we want to gain to stop the big companies, stop the social media, we haven't achieved that. The only thing we achieve is killing the small company here. And if you ask the users, how happy are you for sitting clicking on, I do accept cookies here? I still miss finding one guy being happy for doing that. Yeah. And if you look at specifically also, I mean, just today here in my own company here, I'm sitting talking with 3 clients about GDPR and GDPR. Yeah. And what we're talking about is, this is stuff like, you know, we are maybe using Microsoft Azure to store data. And is that secure? Is that not secure? And could you ask Microsoft please to do blah, blah? And hey, I cannot ask Microsoft to do anything. Yeah, this is just how it is here. So that's another thing I want to put into the table here is that what you're doing with these laws, the regulation, is that you put all the burden down to the small companies sitting negotiating with Google and Microsoft about, you know, maybe some AI engine or something like that. You shouldn't put the burden on that. I mean, if you want to regulate, then regulate the big guys and make some standard contract and make some standard technical implementation and make some standard, and then we can use them. Yeah. Instead of asking the small companies to negotiate with the big companies. This is really like a no-go here. Yeah. Basically, okay, I'll stop now. I'm just saying what I'm seeing so far has just been being. I understand the intention, and I vote for the intention. The intentions are good, but when I see the implementation, it's not fulfilling the intention. Just killing small companies. That's it.
Well, I thank you for speaking your mind freely, and you know, we do in Brussels speak a lot to each other, and sometimes, you know, even if it's uncomfortable, it's really important to hear what people building companies think. I know there's a lot in there, and you know, some of it is probably also addressed to Werner Steng, who is trying to coordinate with the Commission Vice President Vestager the bigger tech agenda. And some of it might be answered by our next speaker, Dirk Staudenmeier, who is maybe able to give us a sneak peek or at least a preview of what the Commission is looking at, DG Connect to be specific, at the Union, when it comes to civil liability aspects of AI. As Werner Steng mentioned at the top, the AI Act is sort of there to set a framework, and it does not look at liability questions. This is something that Dirk is looking at closely. So maybe this is a chance to kind of present the rationale behind why we're looking at this now, and maybe to share where some of the problems are and how this could help startup ecosystems. I'm passing the floor, and thank very much for your time already, to Dirk Stadelmeier.
First, by the way, I'm working in DG Justice, but not in DG Connect. But that doesn't matter for all outsiders. It's the commission basically, and that's what counts. Now, from all what I followed so far from the discussions, basically there was a lot of discussions, and even one speaker made a bit a fun remark about the ex ante perspective. So main discussion was indeed about ex ante and the AI Act. Now, as it was said, I will speak about liability. So that is, if one stays in that with these terms, that's the ex post perspective. So what happens if something has gone wrong? What happens if an accident is caused and somebody has suffered harm? It may be a personal injury, it may be a harm to property, whatever. And laws in all member states foresee different solutions. Basically, perhaps I can give you a very basic example. If you run over by a car, you have normally, and a normal car, not an autonomous vehicle. Yeah, if you run over by a normal car, you have 3 different claims against 3 different people. So you have a claim for compensation against the driver because he committed a fault, he violated a traffic law. You have a claim against the producer if the car was defective. And you have a claim against the owner of the car because there's something which is called strict liability. So this is the normal situation almost all member states have. But the question is, what happens if AI comes into the game? And the problem here is that AI as a technology has several characteristics. And the main ones I want to mention about is autonomy and opacity, which make it very difficult to apply normal existing liability rules to AI. Why? In my example of the car, if you're not run over by a normal car, by an autonomous vehicle, the question is, first of all, there is no driver. So who is liable? And the car itself has no legal personality, so it's not the AI which is liable. It must be a human person. But then if the human person must be liable, either the human person has done something wrong or has been attributed liability by the legislator in terms of strict liability, like the owner of the car for normal cars. If the person has done something, then you need to link back, and that you have to prove as the victim of the accident. The damage you suffered, the harm you suffered, has a causal link with what the liable person has done wrong. Now, the problem is, in the case of a highly developed AI, that somewhere in between the person, the human actor, saying, I put this AI in motion, and the harm done to you, there's an AI somewhere which takes an autonomous decision, which cannot be predetermined by a human, not be foreseen by a human either. You can test it, of course. You can put the car in a traffic situation, and the AI will take a certain decision and do a certain reaction. And if the same traffic situation happens, then the AI will do exactly the same thing. So that's fine. But there is no such thing as the same traffic situation. There will be different parameters, like different lights, different cars participate at different speeds, different weather conditions, whatever. And therefore, the AI may take a different decision, and that you can't foresee. So basically, who is then liable to you if something has happened? And the same is, just a brief words about the second characteristic, that's opacity. Now, I'm speaking with a lot of people who are working with AI, and I'm just a lawyer. I am not an engineer. But what I understood from engineers is that for more highly developed forms of AI, especially machine learning, you can explain how, in abstract forms, how a certain data input leads to a certain data output, which leads to an accident. But you can often not explain why a specific data input leads to a specific data output leads to an accident. So basically, that's the second problem. If the developers cannot explain this, how can you expect that just the normal passenger or job of people walking along the street who is run over by a car, who has to prove this in order to get compensation from somebody, can do that? And that's the problem. And that's what we're dealing with. Now, second point I wanted to make is the panel is, and that was already mentioned several times by previous speakers, about not stifling innovation. Now, obviously, not only do we not want to stifle innovation, we want to promote innovation. We want to promote the rollout of AI, of the technology. Now, what has that to do with liability? It has to do with liability in two aspects. The first one is linked to the businesses themselves who are producing AI technology or disseminating or using AI technology. If something happens and you're causing an accident with that AI system, you're liable. And you need to know that in advance, I would think, because you want to know what your liability risks are, because you need to take that into account. And most importantly, you need to insure yourself against it. And that especially means if you go cross-border and you're facing a different law and different liabilities. So that's the interest. However, if you look at the existing laws, there are two problems which will make it difficult for you to know your liability risks in advance. So the first one is nobody knows how the existing laws will apply to the specifics of AI, which I just mentioned, because there aren't any cases yet, because AI is not yet on the market. And the second thing is that the member states are already speaking now about adapting their laws to these specificities of AI. Now, if every member state, every of the 27 will do this in their own way, the existing fragmentation, which we have already, will get worse. Now, that will not promote AI. And that will not make it easier for small companies, especially those who have no legal department or no lawyer, or even who are shying away from the cost of hiring a lawyer, to help them to know what the liability risks are. So that's the first problem. But the second problem for the rollout of AI is not only the kind of the cost thing, and I'll come back to that in a minute, how that can be solved. But the second problem is the trust issue, because it's also mentioned in the title of the panel. We have done a behavioral economics study with field experiments with citizens, and there are some relatively clear results. First of all, there's a large skepticism out there towards AI. It's a new technology, something people don't know, and yeah, there is out there a large skepticism. Now, we could also say, let's wait. Let's not do anything on liability. Let's get the products on the market. Let's just leave it with the AI Act, which makes sure that, no, not makes sure, but which prevents that accidents will happen. No, reduces the risk. That's the precise formulation. Because safety is not an absolute thing. Safety is a concept of accepted risks. There will be accidents in any case. The risk will be lowered so that the society can accept it and therefore enjoy the advantages of the product compared to the risks. Well, that's the purpose of the ex ante perspective. So accidents will happen. And then what happens then? Imagine there will accidents be happening, and at the moment there's quite a lot of publicity on accidents caused by autonomous vehicles and so on. Yesterday I read something about a vacuum cleaner or a lawnmower going crazy. So basically there's a lot of publicity, and what we found out in the behavioral economic studies also, there's a direct link between the publicity, the amount of publicity these accidents get, and the trust of the people. So the problem is that we are having a situation where people are already worried, and if then accidents happen and they will see that they're not getting their harm compensated, then the trust will go down rapidly. And that will have an influence on the uptake. So basically, if you want to ensure the uptake of the technology and the rollout of technology, you have to make sure that people trust it. And what we found out also in this behavioral economic study, there's a direct link between how a liability system is designed and the trust of the people. The more victim-friendly it is, the more people trust, the more people take it up. So basically, that's the second reason why one should deal with AI liability rules, and that it is not only in the interest of the victim, the second reason, but it's also in the interest of the businesses, because it guarantees the uptake. Now, last point I wanted to make is what happens with small companies who do not have a legal department, as I said earlier, but who will know their risks. Now, they need to insure themselves, as I said so easily earlier. That makes sense, actually, to insure themselves in any case. If you run liability risks, if you have or create liability risks with products, you have an interest to be insured. And we found out, for instance, when we evaluated the product liability directive, that 80% of European companies have a coverage, these are the producing companies, against producer liability risks. So basically, most companies have it already anyway. And if one looks at these policies, the insurance industry tells us that these policies are all risk policies. So they do not even have to be renegotiated. So basically, there is definitely an interest to insure yourselves against possible liability risks with a beneficial effect, because you will not have to pay the damage. Your only cost is the annual insurance premium. And that's worth invested. And I think I'll stop here, because I was supposed only to speak 8 minutes, but I saw there were also some questions in the chat, so I'm happy to have a discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dirk. And I'm in the uncomfortable position of having 4 minutes, and I'm not intending as a German to let anyone go late to their lunch break, but still having 1 or 2 questions to wrap through. So I will appreciate fast answers very much. And since the question, there's a question in the chat here, and it's for you, Dirk, I'll start with this one. It's actually from your fellow co-panelist, Stephen, who's saying that he's been an algorithm professor for 30 years, and he's still not really sure on the AI definition. And specifically about the cars example, he's saying that tons of accidents have happened in decades because in traffic, because AI in cars has been working one way or another way. So he's in a way saying it's not new, but he's also asking more specifically, for decades having had AI in cars, how have we been handling responsibility? What is new? And he himself is not aware of anything new. So what's the concrete need now? Maybe I'll give you, maybe if you can reply within 1 or 2 minutes.
I can be fairly brief. Yeah, we're not talking about all AI. The AI definition of the AI Act is very broad and covers a lot. We're only speaking about those highly developed AI which have these specifics which I mentioned before. So if it's about cars, there's this classification from 0 to 5. We're speaking only about 4 and 5. All the AI which exists now in cars, present law can handle it just fine. We don't need to do anything. Don't repair what ain't broken. We only want to think about those more developed forms of AI, which will come on the market and will be fully autonomous and opaque, and then we'll challenge liability rules. And why do we do this now? Because we want to prepare the grounds. We don't want to wait for the reasons I explained until the first accidents happen and then come in. Because to repair trust, which is already lost, is very difficult. That's the short answer.
Thank you. That's very much appreciated. And looking at what's happening in the chat now, I think I'm really happy because I think we're on the money with the topic of the discussion today. And it's not just kind of relevant for today's discussion, but if the Commission is consulting on and trying to learn more about civil liability aspects of AI, as Dirk has just outlined, there are going to be opportunities, and I'm sure Dirk will be happy when I say that there's now the moment to reach out with your ideas, thoughts, and concerns to DG Just, excuse me, not DG Connect, and Dirk's unit on this. I was also going to ask a very, very quick follow-up to Hugo, if Hugo is still on the line. Hugo, you've heard today, I'm not sure how much doctrine you are aware about, the consultation and potential rules for civil liability aspects of AI. I was going to ask, is this going to mean more work for a legal tech startup? But my very serious question is actually, you've given some feedback on the definition of low and high risk AI in the AI Act. And I believe, or maybe you can just imagine, if the same definition was used in the file that Dirk is working on, would that be good, or would you seek improvement still?
Thanks for the question. Obviously, the more work we have, the happier we are. I think we should strive to have as much coherency and uniformity between texts, because and I will contradict myself with what I just said. Maybe we need the application of such high impact texts will be much easier if we manage to have some uniformity between them. And so I think this should definitely be a key target for the regulator and the legislator. Short and sweet.
Thank you for helping me stick to the times. Look, we've touched so many topics here today. And as you can see, AI is all about innovating in many areas I had no idea about before. So I've learned a lot from the entrepreneurs, and I've also learned a lot about where policymakers are seeing the train going in the European Union. And as we all know, usually where the European Union goes first on legislation, other regions will follow. So we, as the co-organizers at the Danish Entrepreneurs, France Digital, and Allied for Startups, have been super proud and happy to have you all here and kickstart this conversation today. A big thanks also to the team behind the team, Johan, Rasmus, and Co, who've been setting up this call and making sure everything works super seamlessly. I look forward to continuing the conversation. There's a lot, both in the nitty-gritty, but also with the high-level concepts. And you can be sure to hear from us, not just with a little follow-up capturing the highlights from today, but also with more engagement opportunities. And we would love to stay in touch with Dirk and with Werner and others and make sure we keep the ball rolling, because we think good things happen when entrepreneurs speak to policymakers. And it is in that light that I'm wishing everyone a great lunch break. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us this morning, and all the best. Thank you.